So our next speaker, Bernard Avishai, is actually a man of many talents. He's written books on political economy, on the history of Zionism, and he writes a wonderful blog, which I highly recommend, at bernardavishai.com. The reason he's here is, well, I've been reading his blog, but he also had a cover story in Inc. magazine a couple of months ago in the fall. About the Chevy Volt, which is this electric car that's being developed by the car company that we own, General Motors. And given that, you know, it's, well, whether we owned it or not is less important, then the idea of us moving from a carbon-based transportation system to an electric-based one, and what's required is not just the car, but grid underneath that. But what's further required is rethinking the role of government in stimulating and supporting this kind of sustainable industrial development, and understanding how networks of a whole series of kinds, not just open data, but other kinds of real networks, are changing how we have to do economics. And so there's actually a very big idea that I'm afraid Bernie's only going to be able to start to scratch the surface of in his talk, and I apologize for not giving you much more time, which is that perhaps we have the beginnings of something that he calls the mentor state, rather than the welfare state. That the role of the state in setting standards and fostering these kinds of creative networks may be the more promising vision of the future that we're looking for. So here to give you a taste of that vision, Bernard Avishai.
Thank you. It's great to be at a conference where the word personal doesn't just mean narcissistic, but I could get used to introductions like that. The session is called Rethinking Economics, but really what I'm going to be talking about is what I think of as, you know, what we used to call political economy, the methods of production that drive big economic events, and how public policy might respond. I mean, we all read The Wealth of Nations at some point. We know that we start in the pin factory because that's, Smith understood, the place where you sort of get the DNA of the economy. And so I'm going to tell you something that you already know, which is that networks are changing in a very substantial way the architectures and strategies of companies, and therefore the role of government. You know, Smith, in a part of The Wealth of Nations that isn't often read, said that the purpose of the sovereign was to facilitate commerce in general. And, you know, we look presumably beyond sovereigns and markets, but the truth is we still have to know how commerce works and how to facilitate it if we're going to facilitate our freedoms. So I'm going to argue that the changes are surprisingly most evident when you look at the auto industry, which is usually and mistakenly thought of as sort of the last gasp of the old industrial economy. In fact, the Chevy Volt, which we do own 65% of happily, is not really a standalone car. It's probably the most advanced mobile device of the coming generation. And it's a device built in expanding networks for expanding networks, which really have a long way to go. Arguably, the government now has two overriding priorities: the growth of the economy and the greening of the economy. And, you know, you often hear stories about the cars, whether these cars get really, you know, better mileage than hybrids and so on when you add in the Volt's engine that charges the battery. I don't want to get into that in detail. But the most important question, it seems to me, that we're not asking enough, although I was really gratified to hear Anish Chopra this morning describing his view of how the government facilitates networks. the most important question we have to ask about government is how does it manage up the network effect so that whether in refining automotive components or greening the electric grid, we actually create convergence and competition among entrepreneurs. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. I think some of you feel this is sort of intuitively obvious. But I want to take you to a car company, which I think exposes the DNA of the economy probably better than any I know. It's not Volkswagen or GM. It is Marshall's Garage in Elkins, New Hampshire. Here's a story. In 2003, I had this aging BMW. I still have it. It's even aging more. And I drove it over to Dave Marshall's garage in Elkins to ask him where in Manchester or Concord I could get to a BMW dealer because my so-called climate control system had failed. You know, the air conditioner in a BMW, it's a climate control system. It had failed, and I knew that it was a module governed by some little computer and that, you know, I'd have to go to the dealer to get it replaced. So Dave got behind the wheel, fires up the engine, looks, you know, thinks, says, you know, I can do that. I can fix that for you. And I said, I doubted it. and he looked at me sort of not exactly condescendingly, but I followed him inside. And he sits down at his terminal and starts tapping a bunch of soiled keys and goes out to what was, I later learned, the International Automotive Technicians Network, or IATN. He transmits my problem, the make, the year, you know, all the issues that he had discovered, gave me a cup of coffee, and said, you know, I'll work up a report and get back to you. And 3 hours later, he showed me the responses. 17 were consistent, 5 he just threw out. And this had given him the methods of repair, the parts descriptions, parts number, software settings, and parts sourcing. And he was also able to determine, and this is critical, whether or not his diagnostic scanner, the scanner that plugs into the engine and is able to define the problems, could actually be reset with the software that he had. Now, this shouldn't have surprised me, really. I had actually been an architect of KPMG, the consulting company, KPMG's global intranet. And, you know, we did this kind of thing all the time. That's how I got the BMW. But it never really dawned on me how far into the economy these technologies had pervaded. This was 2003. I've subsequently learned that the IATN has now 60,000 users worldwide. It has engineering fora. It has a groupware site which Dave had logged on to for virtually nothing. And you know, member mechanics would come on, check it haphazardly, either to solve a problem or to suggest solutions for the problem. The thing that's so interesting here is that the IATN didn't mean that Dave could just fix my problem, clearly. It meant that he could fix all kinds of problems in all kinds of cars. He was becoming himself a solutions company. For every problem with every car, Dave now had an opportunity to assemble snips of knowledge from federated sources and bundle them together into a kind of deliverable, very much like a KPMG consultant. You know, there was the technical know-how and there was the know-about, which meant he could be a better business strategist. He could procure components from Canada or Mexico. And this was for him the difference between being his own man or somebody else's hand. And here's the thing, he could never have survived independently just 10 or 15 years ago, and he knew it. If he was prepared to strive in his modest way, he could create a family practice in cars. And, you know, hire a bunch of people to work on his team. Now, what does this have to do with public policy? It turns out everything. First of all, you know, if the ownership society needed a poster child, Dave would be an interesting candidate. Particularly that smile of reason on his face when he sort of explained his powers to me. But that's not really where I'm going with this, because there's something else that allowed Dave to do what he did, which was not visible to the naked eye, or to most Republicans, it seems, which is everything to do with an activist federal government. Because cars are becoming these little computers on wheels. And go back to that scanner. The diagnosis that Dave was able to do on my car depended entirely on the scanner being a universal appliance. The car companies make proprietary software, but the hardware is something all mechanics have in common now, because in 1995, so I learned, the EPA mandated that the port from the scanner into the car would be of a standard size, so that every scanner could actually diagnose every car. This was, you know, something that the EPA did because, why? Because it wanted to make it possible for all of these small garages to do fitness checks and checks having to do with pollution. But it actually opened up competition in after-warranty repair for every little garage in America. Dave now didn't have to buy a piece of hardware for every car, if he had to, which was true in the 1980s. If he had had to buy a piece of hardware for every car, it would have been what we like to say in business schools is a barrier to entry. He could never have remained in the game. Scanners mean entrepreneurship. Today, about 70% of after-warranty work is done in little garages like Dave. As we heard from Anish Chopra this morning, standards imply convergence, convergence implies competition. Nor is it hard to imagine what becomes of car mechanics like Dave who are not able to keep working the web the way he was. This is sort of the other side, the other danger of the networked economy, which we like to sort of whistle past the graveyard about. That if you're not prepared to keep learning like people like Dave, your problem is not going to be periodic unemployment, it's going to be chronic unemployability. But again, I don't want to deal with this quite now. The point is that Dave's garage is the fundamental business unit, like the pin factory in The Wealth of Nations. The Kauffman Foundation reports that over half of Americans now work in companies of under 500 employees, and virtually all net new jobs since from 1980 to 2005 were in entrepreneurial companies less than 5 years old. But that's not the only thing. Big companies are themselves made up of swarms of problem-solving teams just like Dave's. I read a piece in the New York Times a few days ago where Bob Reich was talking about the degree to which we are becoming entrepreneured into a great state of insecurity, and was implying, and I actually agreed with much of what he said, we have to make our business life, our work life for entrepreneurs more predictable. We have to make our work more secure through some kind of government action. I can't really go into this now, but the thing he didn't say, which is really important, is that the choice is not really working in a small entrepreneurial firm or working in a big company. Those of you who work in big companies know damn well that your work life depends on your success as an entrepreneur as one of a swarm of problem-solving teams inside that big company. I learned it myself at KPMG, which is why it's an old BMW, but never mind. This is true also about how cars are designed. Here's the Škoda Roomster, for example, which is a landmark vehicle for Volkswagen, not because it's kind of adorable to young couples or very practical to small service businesses, but because of the way it was designed. Network Systems in Volkswagen Group allowed a product team in the Czech Republic the same kind of unprecedented freedom to design that car that Dave had in solving my problem. The old Volkswagen Group model was very simple. The Germans did the engineering in a centralized engineering design hub inside of Wolfsburg, Germany. Around that core engineering platform, you started building the skins that were created either in Czechoslovakia or by Seat in Spain. In 1993, what you see here is, the Fabia, which was the Czech version of the Polo. Different colors, different touches, same car. Today, the Czechs design their own cars. And they're using transparent components networks which critically reduce transaction costs inside of the company so that, in effect, designers can, take components from an a la carte menu for the price of a prefix. The Roomster's front chassis was taken from the Volkswagen Polo, the rear chassis from the first Škoda Octavia. And the Roomster broke even on only 60,000 units, as opposed to 500,000 for the Golf platform. Karl Hahn, who's the former CEO of Volkswagen, who bought Škoda, told me, the Roomster is to the Golf what a symphony of Dvorak is like to a symphony of Brahms. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that if you like Dvorak, you're going to pay a premium for that car. That's the only way car companies make money. That's the only way they get out of the commodification problem. And in fact, Czech designers are now making all kinds of niche vehicles based on their ability to take from a menu of components. How could a design team at Volkswagen Group create an independent design hub without cannibalizing all the other products? Well, they understood something we learned at KPMG, that the job of a corporation's management had changed. And here we get to the beginning of what I think is part of the job that the government has to learn. We had to facilitate the work of distributed designers in a more or less transparent network. It's a non-trivial problem because the network effect, Metcalfe's law, the famous Metcalfe's law, is really much more of a tease than it is a fact. It's true that every person who comes onto a network raises the value of the network by some quantum degree if people understand each other. The problem in networks is that you need a settled context in which to communicate, to overcome the natural inhibitions for sharing information. Where do I put things? Where do I get things? What are the Vanguard things called so that two people working in a Vanguard problem are calling things by the same name? How can I be sure what I say will not be misused? How can I be sure I will share in the wealth I help to create? How will that wealth be measured when, in fact, nowadays the wealth of nations is the result of the chemistry between people acting in productive exchanges on networks? Now, at Volkswagen, this meant a number of things. It meant technical standards for components. It meant a kind of open source within the group so that individual designers could go to this menu and no one business unit could own a supplier. If you had a component, you had to describe it in a standard way. You had to put it up on the network, and you had, in effect, a kind of IP commons, an intellectual property commons within Volkswagen Group, so design hubs could work everywhere. And you also had to make a decision about how success is going to be quantified in a new way. Because when you have so many initiatives and so much potential cannibalization, you have to ask the question, and by the way, the unions in Wolfsburg were asking this all the time about Czech cars, you know, what happens if the Skoda is cannibalizing the market of the Golf? And the head of the business units had to say to the unions, listen, you know, you have to get a look at how much more we're taking from Toyota and Fiat, and not just what Skoda is taking from the Golf. So let's finally get then to the Chevy Volt, because there are some important lessons here. First of all, the Volt itself could never have been developed if it weren't for the networks I just described at Volkswagen. They also are now up to speed in component sharing, which allows the Volt team to focus on those parts of the design, those parts of the invention that are really novel. But the electric cars revolution for the networked economy only begins here. So do a little thought experiment. Imagine that it's 2020 and there are 100,000 cars on the road in Raleigh-Durham, and they're all coming home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This is not really just a George Clooney pitch for a Hollywood movie. It's the reality that we're facing, given the fact that electric cars run at 2 cents a mile and not at 17 cents a mile. What then happens to Duke Energy's grid? The answer is a disaster. Oh, wrong side. The Oak Ridge Labs did an interesting piece of research, and they discovered that if you just added up all the potential power drain of electric cars, if everybody in America had one, all the power drains of electric cars and the amount of energy we're putting out on the grid, in order to make it possible for everybody in America to drive an electric car, you'd only have to increase power on the grid about 10%. Just average versus average. But if only 25% of Americans had an electric car and came home at 5 o'clock and plugged in, you'd actually have to build 160 new power stations to deal with the surge that happens at that hour. We'd be shifting the carbon footprint from cars to power plants. You see, the solution is not in the amount of power, but in the staging, distribution, and sequencing of power on the grid. Electric cars become environmentally beneficial only when they are charged with power taken in off-peak hours from renewable sources. I can't really go into this at length, but the important thing to understand is that in order for the electric car to actually be a green appliance, what you're going to have to do is ask the following question. How do you take it from renewable resources, syndicate the information from the cars, bring it up to the grid, and allow the grid to download electrons to charge batteries, sort of like the way an iTunes app is downloaded from an available server? This is a huge networking problem, and it's going to require a new ecosystem of businesses that are developing to create a kind of conversation between the cars and the grid. Can the grid become smart enough to syndicate demands from millions of electric cars and then transmit power back to individual vehicles from available sources? America has 3,200 power companies, 3,200 which are not the most advanced in the world. So the real question is, what does that ecosystem look like? And I don't have time to go into this, but we have companies like OnStar that GM has a proprietary technology, telecommunications technology developing, working on the syndication of information for charging patterns, companies like GridPoint that are working on smartening the grid and making them responsive and able to digest information from cars. We have companies like Column Technologies that are building charge points in all kinds of public places that don't have them yet. And you have to have the capacity not only to create digestible information for the power companies, but billing information for individual consumers and so on. You want to be able to plug in your car downtown and get the bill on your home bill. These are non-trivial networking problems that are going to require, again, standards. Here's the charging plug. There's already a standard for that. But Column Technologies couldn't begin to build public charge points unless there were already a standard for what that charge plug is going to look like. There's a standard that's now being developed for the syndication of information and the digestion of that information by power companies. But if I'm OnStar and I think I'm going to have an early lead in this area, I don't have a particular interest in participating in a standard. If you look at your cell phone, you know, it took something like 20 years to get a standard for charging plugs on cell phones, which is the USB standard, which could not happen until the European Union absolutely mandated it because individual companies thought that they could have a competitive advantage by keeping the standard of their own. So if I leave you with one principle, obviously I'm not doing justice to the complexity of this. I urge you to go back and read that Inc. article if this really interests you. If I leave you with one, it's the same point that Anish Chopra was making this morning, which is that, you know, governments have a role in catalyzing competition by creating the standards that allow networks to be efficient. Even people inside of the private sector understand this very well. Tony Posowitz, whom I know well, who's the head of the Volt team at GM, told me that they are looking to government to consolidate the standards to make competition among suppliers possible. And that looks a lot like what Volkswagen did in order to make its components network work. It means technical pathways for hardware. It means protocols for software. It means IP exchanges that allow for intellectual property defenses outside of the very slow and clogged patent system. It means new macroeconomic metrics for intangible assets and how people actually create wealth in networks. And of course, it means schools and so forth. And here's where we're talking really about an agenda for what I'm thinking of calling the mentor state, about which another time. Thanks a lot.